There's a diner on the corner of Maple and Fifth in a small town in the Midwest that most people drive through without stopping. The coffee there is strong and black, the booths are cracked vinyl, and the same handful of regulars show up every single morning like clockwork. I'm one of them. My name is Harold Miller. I drive a 1987 Ford pickup truck that my grandson says belongs in a museum. I wear the same canvas jacket most days. I tip well, I don't talk much, and I leave by 8 o'clock so I can take my walk before the heat sets in. Nobody in that diner knows what I'm worth. And for a long time, that's exactly how I wanted it. I've built a life around being invisible, not because I'm ashamed of anything. Lord knows I've earned every dollar and every scar that came with it, but because I learned early on that the moment people know what you have, they stop seeing who you are. So I stayed quiet, I stayed small, and I watched. That's the thing people never understand about men like me. We're not sleeping. We're never sleeping. We're just patient. And patience, as it turns out, is the most powerful thing in the world. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or quietly pushed aside by someone who thought they had you figured out, this story is for you. Because on one particular Tuesday evening in the finest restaurant in Bridgeton County, 3 people sat down at a table thinking they were about to take everything from me. They had no idea what was waiting in my coat pocket. But that was just the beginning of my plan.
Let me take you back a few years, because nothing that happened at that dinner table makes sense without understanding who Harold Miller actually is. I was born in 1948, the second son of a bricklayer and a schoolteacher. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Enough food, enough discipline, and more than enough stubborn pride to go around. My father used to say, "Harold, a man who talks too much about what he's done has usually stopped doing anything worth talking about." I never forgot that. By the time I was 32, I had scraped together enough money, enough nerve, and one very good business partner to start Miller Construction. We built our first contract on a government road project in 1981. It wasn't glamorous. It was mud and concrete and 14-hour days and a trailer office with a leaking roof. But it grew. Lord, did it grow. By the mid-90s, Miller Construction was the largest regional builder in 4 counties: hospitals, schools, infrastructure, commercial parks. If something went up in this part of the state, chances are we had a hand in it. I could have moved to a bigger city. I could have bought a bigger house. My accountant begged me to more than once. I didn't. I liked my town. I liked my diner. I liked knowing the name of the woman who refilled my coffee every morning. That was worth more to me than any penthouse in Columbus. By the time my daughter Emily was born, late in life, later than I'd planned, after years of heartbreak I won't go into here, I had already decided how I was going to live out the rest of my days. Quietly, carefully, and with both eyes open. Emily grew up knowing we were comfortable, but she didn't grow up knowing the scope of it. That was intentional. I didn't want her chasing money. I wanted her chasing something real. And for a long time, I believed she had. She was smart, my Emily, sharp as a tack, with her mother's warmth and my stubborn streak. She went to college, came back home, took a job at a nonprofit, and one spring afternoon called me to say she'd met someone. His name was Ryan Caldwell. "Dad," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, "I really think he's the one." I told her I was happy for her. I told her to bring him by for dinner. What I didn't tell her was that before Ryan Caldwell ever sat down at my kitchen table, I already knew quite a bit about him. I know that sounds unsettling, but understand, I'm not a suspicious man by nature. I'm just a careful one. And when your only daughter calls to tell you she's in love, a careful man does his homework. Ryan Caldwell, 34 years old, born in Cincinnati, finance degree from Ohio State, had started 2 small businesses, one modest success, one quiet failure. Worked hard, paid his debts. No red flags. Nothing that concerned me. What struck me, though, what I noticed the moment he walked through my front door and shook my hand, was his eyes. They were the kind of eyes that were always calculating something. Not malicious, not cruel, just hungry. I recognized that look. I had worn it myself 40 years ago. A hungry man isn't necessarily a bad man. I've known plenty of hungry people who built beautiful things with that drive. But hunger without direction, hunger without loyalty, that's a dangerous thing. So I watched, and I waited. "He seems like a capable young man," I told Emily after their first visit. "He is, Dad," she said. "He's really ambitious. He wants to build something." I nodded slowly. "Good," I said. "Ambition is fine. Just make sure you know what he wants to build it for." She laughed, thinking I was being an old-fashioned father. Maybe I was, or maybe even then something in my gut was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. If you've ever had that feeling, that quiet unease you can't quite name, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
They got engaged the following spring. Emily called me from the restaurant where Ryan had proposed, crying happy tears, and I sat in my kitchen with a glass of iced tea and told her I was over the moon. I meant it. I truly did. And so, about 6 months before the wedding, I made a decision. I brought Ryan into the company. Now, I want to be clear about something. I didn't tell him it was my company. Miller Construction had been quietly restructured over the years into a holding group. The branding was different. The day-to-day management ran through a board I'd assembled. To anyone looking from the outside, I was just a retired old man with some investment interests. Ryan was brought in as a senior operations director through a contact who owed me a favor. He was told it was a well-positioned regional firm with growth potential. He wasn't told about my involvement. Some people might call that deception. I call it a final exam. I gave him real responsibility, real authority, real problems to solve. I watched the quarterly reports. I had people I trusted give me honest assessments of how he handled pressure, how he treated people below him on the ladder, and whether his word meant anything. For 2 years, the results were good. Not perfect. Ryan had a sharp edge sometimes, a tendency to push too hard, to prioritize the numbers over the people. But he course-corrected when challenged. He listened. He improved. I began to think maybe I'd been too cautious. Maybe this young man was exactly what he appeared to be. I was starting to let my guard down. I should have known better. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in October. It was Emily. "Dad, Ryan's parents are in town. They'd love to have dinner, all of us together. Ryan made a reservation at Hargrove's." Hargrove's, the nicest restaurant in the county. White tablecloths, candlelight, the kind of place you'd go when you want to impress someone or make a statement. Something shifted in my chest. A small thing, like a stone dropping into still water. "Of course," I said. "What time?" I put on my good jacket, not my best, just my good one, and I drove my truck to Hargrove's that Friday evening. The parking lot was full of newer cars. I pulled into a spot in the back and sat for a moment, just breathing. I don't know what I expected. Maybe an awkward dinner with Ryan's parents, maybe some posturing, some polite conversation about family and futures. What I did not expect was what was already waiting on that table. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, this story is for you. Because what happened inside Hargrove's that night cracked something open in me that I hadn't felt since I was a young man fighting to save everything I'd built. Only this time, it wasn't business on the line. It was family.
Ryan's parents were already seated when I arrived. Donald Caldwell was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s with a politician's handshake and a salesman's smile. His wife, Patricia, was polished and quiet, the kind of woman who's learned to sit beautifully while the men around her do damage. Emily wasn't there yet. Ryan said she was running a few minutes behind. I sat down. We ordered drinks. Donald made small talk about the drive up, about the weather, about Ohio State football. I played along. I'd been playing along with men like Donald Caldwell my entire life. And then, just as the appetizers arrived, Emily walked in. She kissed my cheek, slid into the seat beside me, and smiled at everyone at the table. She was glowing. She had no idea. I watched Ryan across the table. His jaw was tight. His eyes kept moving between me and his father. And I thought, he knows something is about to happen. That told me everything. Donald cleared his throat. He reached beside his chair and lifted a manila envelope, thick, official-looking, the kind that comes with intent, and set it in the center of the table. "Harold," he said, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Emily looked confused. Ryan looked at the tablecloth. I looked at Donald, and I didn't say a word. He opened the envelope and spread out the documents. Photocopies of old business records, a deposition from 1993, a sworn affidavit, an article from a regional paper I hadn't seen in 30 years. The story they told, or rather the story Donald believed they told, was this: that in 1991, I had deliberately pushed out my original business partner, a man named George Fitch, by falsifying financial records and cutting him out of a contract that should have been shared. According to Donald, George Fitch was Ryan's grandfather, and Donald had spent years nursing that grievance like a wound that never healed. "George went to his grave believing you stole from him," Donald said. His voice was even, controlled. "And now that my son is engaged to your daughter, I think we have an opportunity to set things right." The demands were laid out simply: a transfer of 15% of my holding company's equity, a signed letter of apology, and silence, permanent contractual silence about the whole affair. "Otherwise," Donald said, leaning forward slightly, "this goes public. The press, the State Business Bureau, everyone." Emily had gone pale. Her hand found mine under the table. I looked at Ryan. He was looking at his water glass. Not at me, not at Emily, at his water glass. And that silence, that deliberate, cowardly silence, hurt more than anything Donald Caldwell had said. Because Ryan wasn't ignorant of this plan. You don't bring someone to the finest restaurant in the county for a surprise ambush without knowing the ambush is coming. He hadn't orchestrated it, perhaps, but he hadn't stopped it either. And in my book, those two things are closer than most people admit. I sat very still. I thought about Emily beside me. I thought about 30 years of work. I thought about George Fitch, who I had known and who I had fought, and whose story was a great deal more complicated than the one sitting on that table. And then I reached into my inside coat pocket, and I placed my own envelope on the table. "Before anyone says anything else," I said quietly, "I'd like you to look at what's in there." Donald frowned. He didn't reach for it immediately. Men like Donald always want to control the pace. So I opened it myself. The first document was a certified audit from 1991. It showed, in clear financial language, that George Fitch had been systematically siphoning funds from our shared operating account over a period of 14 months. Not a lot at once, enough to look like accounting errors if you weren't paying attention. I had been paying attention. The second document was a letter, George's own handwriting, addressed to a silent third party, discussing the redirection of a major government contract to a shell company George had established without my knowledge. The third was the settlement agreement we had reached privately in 1992. George Fitch had not been pushed out. He had been given a choice, as I had given many people in my life: own what you did or face the legal consequences. He chose to walk away quietly. He took a fair buyout, more than fair, given the circumstances, and I had kept his name out of the courts because he had a family, and because I am not a man who destroys people when I don't have to. George Fitch didn't go to his grave a victim, I said, looking at Donald directly. He went to his grave knowing what he'd done. Whatever story he told your family, I'm sorry for it, but it wasn't the truth. The table was very quiet. Patricia's hand had moved to her husband's arm. Donald's face had gone through several shades of color. Ryan's finally looking at me. And then I said the thing that changed everything. I said it quietly, not to wound, just to end the pretense. "Ryan," I said, "the company you've been working at for the past 2 years, the one you were brought into, the one's quarterly reports you've been filing, the one you've been building your career inside of?" I paused. "I built that company. It's mine, every brick of it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Emily turned to look at Ryan. Ryan stared at me. Donald set down his fork. I watched Ryan's face carefully in that moment. I watched the calculations stop. I watched something else move in, something raw, something real. The realization wasn't just that his father's plan had crumbled, it was that he had been used. His own father had maneuvered him into position like a chess piece without fully telling him where the board was. He'd been kept just informed enough to not ask questions and just ignorant enough to have plausible innocence. That's a terrible thing to discover about your own father at a dinner table. "I didn't," Ryan started. "I know. Not entirely." Donald pushed back from the table. "This doesn't change. It changes everything," I said, and my voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You came to this table with a fiction, Donald, and I'm sorry that you've carried it this long. I'm sorry George told you what he told you, but you built a plan on a lie, and you were willing to use your own son to execute it." I let that sit. "Now," I folded my hands, "here is where we are. You can take those papers home and understand what they actually say, or you can walk out of here and try to make noise with a story that won't hold up to 30 seconds of legal scrutiny. That's your choice." I turned to Ryan. "And you," I said, "you have a different choice to make." Ryan met my eyes. For the first time all evening, he looked like himself. Not the operations director, not the ambitious young man with the hungry eyes, just a person, sitting in the consequences of a night he hadn't fully chosen, but hadn't fully refused either. "You knew something was planned tonight," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. One slow, honest nod. "And you came anyway?" Another nod. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Because I thought maybe my dad was right, that there was something owed, and I wanted to believe that." "At now?" He looked at his father, then at Emily, whose eyes were full of tears she hadn't yet let fall. "Now I think I let myself believe something easier than the truth," he said, "and I'm ashamed of that. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, this story is for you. Because the thing about betrayal, the real complicated thing, is that it's almost never pure. It's almost never one person entirely villainous doing one entirely unforgivable thing. It's usually someone making the wrong choice in a weak moment for a reason they could almost justify. What matters is what they do when the light comes on." Donald Caldwell left that table without another word. Patricia followed, her face unreadable. I don't know what they said to each other in the parking lot. I don't know what happened on the drive home. What happened at our table was this. Ryan looked at his future father-in-law, a man he'd been working for without knowing it, a man he'd just tried, however passively, to extort. And he said, "I'm sorry, Harold. I don't have any excuse that's worth your time. I'm sorry." Emily reached across the table and took his hand, not to absolve him, just to hold on. And I looked at them both for a long moment, this young couple at the edge of something, and I thought, this is the moment that will define them. Not the mistake, the recovery.
The next day was a Saturday. I drove my truck to the diner at 7:15 like always. I ordered my coffee, black. I sat in my usual booth by the window and watched the town wake up slowly. The delivery trucks, the dog walkers, the couple across the street opening their hardware store. Ordinary things. Beautiful things, if you know how to look. My phone buzzed once. A text from Ryan. It said, "I'd like to meet with you when you're ready. Not about the company, just to talk." I set the phone face down and finished my coffee. A lot of people, I think, would have done something dramatic in my position. Fired him, cut Emily off until she came to her senses, issued some kind of ultimatum that made the power structure clear. I'd spent my whole life resisting that impulse. Power that needs to announce itself isn't really power.
It's just noise. I texted back 3 words, Monday, 7 a.m. He was waiting outside my office when I arrived. He looked like he hadn't slept. Good. That meant he understood the weight of it. We sat across from each other in the same office where I'd made $1,000 decisions and $1,000,000 mistakes, and Ryan Caldwell did something I didn't expect. He didn't make excuses, he didn't try to explain or contextualize any edges. He simply said, I think I've been running towards success so hard for so long that I stopped checking what I was willing to do to get there. My father handed me a story, and I wanted it to be true because it made what I wanted feel more justified. That was wrong, and it almost cost me the only things that actually matter. He slid a letter across the desk. His resignation. I looked at it. I didn't pick it up. You worked 2 years in my company, I said. How would you say you did? He blinked, uncertain. I think I did well. The Riverside project came in under budget. The Harrison County bid was mine. It was, I agreed. And you were fair to the people under you. Not perfect, but fair. Harold, I'm not going to pretend Friday didn't happen, I said, and I'm not going to tell you it's forgotten. It isn't. But there's a difference between a mistake that shows me who you are and a mistake that shows me where you are. I slid the resignation letter back to him. Where you are, I said slowly, is at the beginning of actually knowing what you believe. That's not a small thing. Most men never get there. He stared at the letter. You're not firing me. I'm not firing you, but I am watching you. And from this point forward, there's no test. What you see is what's real. The company, my involvement, all of it. No more layers. Why? He asked. And it was a genuine question. Not negotiation, not relief. He really wanted to understand. I thought about it for a moment. Outside my window, the town was going about its business. A school bus rumbled past. Somewhere down the block, someone was hammering something. Finally, I said, because I built this company for a reason. Not for money, not for legacy. I built it so that one day I'd have something worth leaving to people who deserved it. And the only way to know if someone deserves it is to see what they do when it gets hard. I looked at him steadily. Friday was hard, and you told the truth when it would have been easier not to. That means something to me. He nodded. He pressed his lips together and nodded, and I could see him trying to hold himself together. Don't make me regret it, I said. I won't. I promise you, I won't. If you've ever been given a second chance by someone who had every right to walk away, you know that a promise like that lands differently than any other. It's not just words. It's the weight of what you almost lost settling onto your shoulders like something you'll carry for the rest of your life. That's not a burden. That's a compass.
The wedding was the following May. Small, simple, the way Emily had always wanted it. The ceremony was outdoors, under a sky so blue it looked painted. I walked my daughter down a path of white gravel, past rows of wooden chairs filled with people who loved her, and I gave her hand to a young man who, God help him, was still learning who he was, just like I was at his age, just like we all are. Donald Caldwell was not there. That was Ryan's decision, made quietly and without drama. He'd spoken to his father after the dinner, in a conversation none of us were part of. I don't know exactly what was said. I only know that Ryan came back from it looking older, and that the subject was never raised again. There are wounds in families that don't heal in a season. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes a generation. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is hold the door open and wait, without holding your breath. Patricia sent a card. I thought that was something. The months that followed were good ones. Not perfect, nothing real ever is. Ryan made mistakes at work, the way capable people do when they're still growing into big shoes. He and Emily had their fights, their adjustments, the ordinary negotiations of two people building a life. But he called me every Sunday morning. Not about business, just to talk. About the week, about whatever Emily was working on, about things he'd been thinking. Sometimes about his grandfather, about the story he'd grown up with, about what it meant to grieve a version of history that turned out to be incomplete.
I listened. I didn't always have answers, but I showed up every Sunday, and I listened. That, I've come to believe, is most of what family actually is. I still drive my truck, still order my coffee at the same diner, at the same booth, at the same time every morning. Carol still refills my cup without asking. The vinyl is still cracked. The coffee is still strong. Sometimes a new customer comes in and sits a few booths over, and I see them glance at me, at the old man in the canvas jacket, driving the old truck, minding his own business, and I know what they see. They see someone ordinary. And I think, good. Because here's what I've learned in 76 years of living, building, losing, fighting, and eventually, finally, letting go. The greatest power you will ever have is not the power to destroy someone who wrongs you. It's not the power to expose them, humiliate them, or take back what they tried to take. The greatest power is the power to choose what to do with the truth once you have it. Donald Caldwell came to that table thinking he had the truth. He had a story, one he believed, one that had shaped him, one that had been passed down to him wrapped in grief and grievance. And I understand that. I have compassion for it even. But a story that keeps you in anger for 30 years isn't serving you. It's consuming you. I chose something different. I chose to show the truth, not to punish, but to free Ryan from a plan he hadn't chosen, to free Donald, if he was willing, from a wrong he'd been carrying, to free Emily from a secret I should have told her years ago, and to free myself from the weight of being unknown. That night at Hargrove's, I put my card on the table. Not a business card, not a check. The real card. The truth about who I am and what I'd built and what I was willing to protect. And when you're willing to put all of that on the line for something as simple and as complicated as family, that's when you find out what you actually have. I have my daughter. I have a son-in-law who's becoming, slowly and honestly, the man I hoped he could be. I have my diner and my truck and my town and my Sunday morning phone calls. I have what matters. That day, justice was finally served. Not the dramatic, thunderclap kind you see in movies. The quiet kind. The kind that lives in a choice made across a restaurant table, a letter not picked up, a phone call made every Sunday without fail. The kind that rebuilds. So let me ask you something as we come to the end of this story. If someone handed you a moment like that, when the truth was in your hands, and the person who'd wronged you was sitting right across the table, when you had every right to level them and walk away, what would you have done?